Okay. So that said, I'll be your host today. I work for Data AI for more than 2 years right now, and I work with customers in Central Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And let's start rather high level. So let's start with the big picture, comparing the trend for the past 3 years when it comes to the volume of downloads for mobile games and for consumer spend inside games. You have to push really hard to make it work. Uh, oh, no, I think I pushed too many times. So there you go. So so speaking of macros, now we're all kind of aware of the consumer spend dip in the last year, and that concerned a lot of gaming publishers. But let's put it into broader perspective. I think what's happening throughout the past years, like pre-pandemic, COVID, past year, 3 years, and the last year, 2022, I think we have to keep in mind that the overall volume of downloads nonetheless has increased. Like, so we're living in a different reality right now when it comes to weekly number of downloads from the stores or like weekly consumer spend globally. And that has different twists in different markets. We're going to follow like the key markets later in this presentation. But uh, just I would like to pay attention to the significance of the previous 2 years before we analyze the minus 6 billion drop in the last year, because it's basically the market grew by 30 billion in the 2 years before it dipped a little, 6 billion. And I appreciate that there's more to come probably with the post AT&T world. We're all living that reality, and there's much more turbulence probably expected. This is our Data AI's forecast for the next year. But yeah, I think that's important to acknowledge that. So we're living in a different reality. And that said, this reality translates into the volume of downloads by platform and consumer spend by platform. And by analyzing using the platform split, we can see the following. So basically, iOS volume of downloads is pretty much flat. So the growth that came in the past like several years came primarily through Google Play. So that's just fact number one that we have to account for. That's a graph on the left, where you see the big pink bars growing, whilst the iOS is still kind of pretty much at the same level. Then when it comes to consumer spend, iOS used to be the driver, but then apparently after the changes that Apple introduced, that affected the overall consumer spend on that platform due to inability to target whales and other factors. But when it comes to the total hours, unfortunately, we can measure this only for the Android phone. I think we're post-pandemic, we're living in a different reality. We look at the mobile games, so the total hour consumption is almost the same when it used to be at the peak of the pandemic, when everything was locked. There is no other ways of entertaining ourselves other than just playing mobile games and watching Netflix and TikTok. If you look at the level of competition, starting very high level, number of apps released by year. Analyzing games market, we can see that there used to be a blooming period of like mid 2020. It's like 2015, where there was like huge volumes of games released on the iOS side. But then this like iOS started to scrutinize the platform regulation when it comes to the quality of those games, and that affected the number of incremental games released by year. But that said, the markets are very saturated, and therefore that obviously has implications that affects organic visibility. So therefore, any kind of user acquisition realistically is pay driven these days, whether you want it or not. So this is what we live in right now. When it comes to number of apps released, it's pretty much the similar trend, although it wasn't that big of a growth to begin with on the iOS in the mid of 2015, and therefore there wasn't such a correction following. But that said, the number of active apps on the stores is staggering. Now we're going to look at the distribution by geo, but because as a growth planner, you have to expect where the growth is supposed to come from, and you might see some numbers in your console, in your with your attribution partners, like where exactly the game has been downloaded, where you focus on when it comes to paid user acquisition. But also, the macros and the markets has changed significantly. We're gonna take a broader perspective right now into since basically 2010 up until 2022. How do we got where we got right now? And this is what the video slide that was. Okay, hopefully you will be able to see it. Let's see. There you go. So the situation obviously wasn't the same like altogether. So the rise of India was a phenomenon of the past several years. Then the tier markets, this is where there was a higher number of smartphones historically, and then you have to analyze how we get there. And this situation is not static. So we see still the number of internet penetration in countries like Egypt, India, or Pakistan is growing. So we see significant distribution trends affecting the global markets. So I wish this animation was a bit slower, so you'll be able to see more. But nonetheless, it's important to study how we get where we get. So now we're going to look at the buying power and the multipliers when it comes to platform distribution. So both sides of this graph are aligned when it comes to countries. For example, you see India first on the left, and you see India first on the right. Even though for the consumer spend perspective, it's minor. And on this graph, you might find several buckets of the countries where you typically monetize. The blue ones are like well-known tier one kind of Western markets. The one that have the little red arrow in front of them are tier one Eastern markets. And then this stands against the overall number of downloads and the multiplier by platform, like the ratio for Google Play to iOS. And I would just encourage you to keep this picture in mind when we're analyzing anything when it comes to genre performance, consumer spend, and so on. These are the places where you get the distribution, and these are the places where you monetize specifically. And as you can see, there's a high concentration when it comes to number of countries globally. For those who would like to analyze, you would have the access to the presentation deck after we finish, so we can spend some time with it. But this picture is quite interesting. Then let's look at the historical perspective, because we all witnessed the enormous growth that happened at the time of lockdown. But the question is this growth sustained over the past several years on the country level? And we're going to be doing this analysis using the device population data. So we're going to be basically dividing the consumer spend, in-app purchase spend on the country level by the device population, just to even out the effects, for example, of number of handheld devices growing in India. So we can basically put the same, equalize basically all those countries when it comes to buying power. And there are some interesting trends, like starting from the iOS. So Japan has been historically one of the countries where people tend to spend the most on mobile gaming regardless, because gaming is a whole different story there. But you as a developer, you have to build purposely for such countries to be highly competitive, because even though the per device spend is significant, it's only like a handful of titles that generate the bulk of this spend. That said, it's like winner takes it all approach in Japan. So is in countries like South Korea or like mainland China. But that said, like Japan experienced a tremendous dip. Like you would see this on the overall country spend level. I think the decline is like minus 16% year over year, like 2022 versus the previous year. And on the per device spend, it dropped even more. On the contrary, and the people didn't stop spending in Japan. They just spend it differently. So right now, what we see growing in Japan when it comes to consumer spend are spent on OTT, on other ways of entertainment. So even though the buying power is shrinking because the economy isn't in the best shape, people surprisingly shift not to mobile games but to other forms of entertainment, being the OTT or, for example, tipping on the short video platform or other ways, right? And then the interesting trend. So it basically it is consistent on both sides, on Google Play and on iOS side. And then a few interesting findings over here is basically for Western countries, the trend isn't that significant. So the growth 2019 to 2022 was significant, but then I think we're just set ourselves at the same level. And even though the well-known issues of post-AT&T era affected like tier one markets like US, it's still the per device drop wasn't that significant. Okay. If we analyze it from a different angle, comparing basically two platforms inside the country, you might find some interesting results because you would expect, for example, like iOS users to spend more. That's just a kind of a gut feeling that everyone has as a developer. But that's not the case for markets like, for example, South Korea, which is A, dominated by Google Play, and B, per user spend on Google Play is much higher than it is on the iOS. So you just have to keep in mind those kind of those gaps, because the gap, as you can see, is yes. Okay. Oh yeah. I think the people on the far side are losing me a little bit. So yeah, I will speak up. Yeah. So what I was saying is that you have to account for the buying power significance, and it's not universally true that for example, iOS users spend more like on a per user basis. Like we're places in South Korea where people actually spend more per device on Google Play than they do on the iOS. And this is an interesting observation that you might keep in mind when you're planning your growth. So it's not, it's not given, that's you can acquire more quality and more paying high LTV users on the iOS. And this is a situation that I was explaining, the kind of a weighted in the device population growth in the past several years by consumer spend in the key markets. I just put two tier one markets like US and UK as an example versus like South Korea and Japan. And as you can see, Japan Japan was declining like rapidly in pretty much throughout. Since the peak of the pandemic, it was a steady decline. And then countries like South Korea have kind of a, I would say, side trend. And then tier one Western markets are, I would say, incrementally growing, but more so for the US than less so for the UK market. Now moving forward into the level of competition, so that you can expect whilst launching by platform in different markets. So we're going to be starting at the genre level. So we're looking in the descending order, top subgenres of mobile games by the volume of downloads in Google Play. So surprisingly not, if we look at let's just preempt this slide basically with this picture. And I apologize, it's the clicker isn't really clicking, so oh. Okay. If you have another one, maybe. Thanks so much. Thank you. Yep. All right. Now this one is perfect. So let's continue. So let's start with this picture. So we're looking at the global gaming market by the volume of downloads. And surprisingly not, hyper-casual is still there and it's dominating. So it's basically like 1/3 of the downloads visually is coming from all the types of hyper-casual genres. And hyper-casual proven to be a nice source of traffic for the rest of the titles over here. And as you will see later in the presentation, if you look at the consumer spend perspective, these are the one that hyper-casual is feeding into. So hyper-casual is still there. Now, if you look at the most popular subgenres from the downloads perspective, you might see that pretty much popular things are popular from the distribution perspective consistently. So things that are popular on Google Play are popular on iOS, like with very few exceptions. But the things are much more different when it comes to buying power and consumer spend, because this is where the differences actually are coming from. And you would see pretty much the same picture as you can see, like on the top titles level over here. Then you see on the right side. But that said, the differences are there, and specifically, I would bucket them into two groups. So I highlighted the arrows in two colors. So one is like I would say female-skewed games like coloring or like solitaire or kind of a puzzle games. That has surprisingly, they're leaning towards Google Play in general when it comes to global market distribution. So this graph is basically shows you like in different colors, different platforms, and then this barely readable yellow line shows the difference. So when the yellow line is higher, then means like the gap between the two columns is more significant. So this is the observation number one I would like for you to keep in mind. And the second one is basically like the teens playing simulation games or open world games like Roblox or other kind of GTA style simulators. These are much more popular on the Google Play side than they are on the iOS side, from the distribution perspective, from the number of downloads and number of people playing, obviously. That said, if we look at this graph from the App Store perspective, so we're just ranking the same graph, but for the genres that are leaning towards, instead of Google Play, iOS, we see some other observations. And those would be like the main takeaway from me would be that, for example, world or puzzle games that have been on the rise in the past few years due to big launches by Apple and others. Those are leaning strongly towards like the iOS. And even though the difference of like 1% doesn't sound significant, it naturally is very significant. So, and this is what I would recommend you paying attention to, because like the kind of a logical puzzle games are and word games are leaning towards iOS. And then comes the interesting part. So, like, this is the distribution, but how are you actually supposed to earn from that audience? And this is the same graph, but you can see very different split over here. And the reason being is because it's a breakdown by consumer spend. This is where the difference comes into play. And I'm just making two examples over here. So one is like match games, and match games are historically leaning much strongly towards iOS. And the difference is like 2% consumer spend globally, but it's disproportionately has higher spend on the iOS. And vice versa, for example, things like RPG, even if you exclude from the equation, I don't know, Japanese like core players, even for the markets like US, you will see that RPG, for example, in the US has a 5% difference in the consumer spend. So there are less things that people spend on in Google Play, but when they do, like RPG is one of those like genres that they actually spend money on. So there are hardcore RPG players out there, even on the Western side of the world. I'm not even saying like China and Korea and Japan. So that's an interesting takeaway from this slide. And this picture is much more is much different. So I would say it's just as I said, if you look at instead of genre, just a bit deeper on the subgenre level, this is where you can quickly find the differences over here. So things like RPG games or match games or strategy games, they're very differently distributed when it comes to where people spend by platform. And we're looking at purely US market, just to make things equal, because the number of downloads is pretty much equal in the US market. The device population is equal. And this is just a nice market to study when it comes to kind of a buyer behavior and the audience behind the platform. Okay. And again, if you look at this beloved graph, so this is where you can find the differences. So, for example, Google Play, as I've told, is leaning strongly towards like team battle, forex, uh, RPG games, and iOS, on the flip side, I would say, is leading the way when it comes to female-oriented match games with the classical progression or with some meta gameplay. And when it comes to creative sandbox, this is the place where people spend money, not only play but spend, right? So as you can see, the difference is very significant. So almost like more than 2 times, despite the fact that the distribution is much higher on the Google Play for, say, Robloxes of the world. Yeah. And now we're going to look at another angle of the markets, which is a competitive presence. And we're going to be measuring competitive presence in 2 ways. So one is what is the concentration by top 3, top 20, and the rest of the market on the subgenre level. And the second one would be the cohorts by, I'll say, vintage year, right? So how many new titles are generating downloads, or how many old titles are dominating the market, okay? And this is the first type of analysis that you would see. So this has to do with the share in the number of downloads of top 3 on the left, top 20, it's like 17 to 20, and the rest, so others like. And this graph is sorted in descending order in the overall number of downloads on the genre level, and surprisingly not, hyper casual is leading the way. And as you can see, the level of competition is just, is very, very different. So obviously, hyper casual is driven by new, unique gaming experience. Therefore, there isn't a lot of old hyper casual games out there that are still maintaining the competitiveness. And like vice versa, on some core side of things, the market is much more concentrated, even from the downloads perspective. And downloads is basically a measure of new cohorts of users acquired. And if we're looking at the like core games with higher LTV, people typically play for much longer. That's why downloads doesn't measure the whole picture. But if you look at from the consumer spend, again, this is where this difference would be striking. Okay. And this is the same view on the same market sorted by downloads on the Google Play, but using the cohorts by vintage year. So the games that have been released in the past 12 months, 1 to 2 years, and older than 2 years, like older titles. And from the downloads perspective, you would naturally expand the left side to be much bigger, because if you're just launching, obviously you would get some downloads. Like there's no exception to that. It's just like from the consumer spend, we're looking at the same picture. This is where you see the genres that are completely dominated by old titles, and you can hardly squeeze in like from the get-go if your LTV is not high enough, because you're not going to be able to afford the buying traffic in such genres like, for example, classical match games or other games and so on. So you have to get the mature enough from the beginning to enter. And this picture would help with your analysis. I would recommend taking this offline and just spending some time with it. So, and this is what I was talking about. So this picture looks very different. So the pink side on the left looks very different when we're looking from the consumer spend perspective. And this is where concentration happens. And obviously, it takes time for you to develop and to optimize the game to ensure that the LTV is high enough. You can scale, you can buy good quality traffic. And that's natural. But there are some genres or some subgenres that are much disproportionately more highly competitive, and it's pretty much very challenging to enter those subgenres. The same with hybrid casual, because in this picture you still see hyper casual, but instead of the top, it will be on the bottom because the spend in hyper casual games is close to zero. But that picture, I would say, represent so-called hybrid casual. The titles that, despite the fact that they have high distribution, they also drive significant in-app purchase revenue. And as you can see, this picture is much less competitive, right? So there's like three titles generating 70% on Google Play and almost like 20% on the iOS side. So hybrid casual is you know is much more concentrated when it comes to people are able to produce such games that actually generate in-app purchase revenue. And the same picture by Vintage here, and you can see it's almost black. Like, and the takeaway here is that it takes time to optimize for high consumer spend, and therefore the older titles tend to generate much higher output in the end of the day. But that said, hyper casual you can still kind of squeeze in because not all even the bigger publishers are experimenting or like putting additional emphasis on the hybrid casual side. That's why you'd see like titles launched in the past or the year before are generating basically the bulk of the revenue. So there's a room for entering this market, for example, versus like Casino, which is like 90% on Google Play and like 90% on iOS. Very highly optimized, very tough competition. And just one example, if we go even one step lower, because previously we were looking at for example, match. Match is a genre, right? But inside match there are subgenres, and there are differences. Like if you split match by type of gameplay that a user has, like starting from the classical match games, the ones that have some meta gameplay, or some not so usual genres like like something like Blast or Connect titles. This is where you see that there's a huge disparity when it comes to who's actually acquiring the traffic and who is able to capitalize from this traffic altogether. So there are pockets of growth one step lower, and you have to be on that level of understanding before you plan your gameplay, your core gameplay, and maybe your secondary gameplay, because that would affect how you compete for the traffic, and that effectively affect how successful you can be as a publisher. And to my previous point, for example, something like Bubble Shooter or Blast Plus with some meta gameplay are moderately competitive. You still enter this market in the past several years, despite like the general understanding that all matches like it's a red ocean, right? So nobody's breathing there aside from maybe a few companies globally, right? So yeah, so there are differences, yeah. And I would say if we preempt the next chapter in this analysis, I would say if Mariusz allows, the next GameCamp would be focused on the monetization tactics by platform. And luckily, right now we just released the ad revenue part of the equation. So previously, when we're talking revenue, we're speaking about in-app purchase revenue. But obviously, that for the bulk of the publishers, that's not the primary driver for their revenue. And finally, we got this product release, and hopefully by the time of the next camp, we'll be able to present much more granular kind of a strategies when it comes to how you're supposed to earn like in-app or ad revenue.
Yeah, thank you, Dimitri. I really encourage you to look at some previous presentations of Dimitri. Like some of them are shared at the GameCamp website, at the GameCamp Lite pages. You have a lot of presentations around like different gaming genres and apps as well. So let's put some Q&A. It seems that we don't have still the questions. So then let's start with a very simple one. Do you see any differences between growth of the mobile gaming and apps market in this case?
Well, growth strategies, of course, are different, and one is just in the recent years due to the fact that the way you used to acquire and the when performance marketing work for iOS is very different still than it is for Google Play. And there's a looming shadow, over us. But still, obviously, that affects everything. So that affects how much you can scale and how much you can trust your own data when it comes to scaling certain user acquisition channels. So obviously, they're very, very different. And to the point that I made earlier regarding for example, hyper casual, is it still, there? It is, and the reason being is that this is still like a remedy for acquiring, relatively cheap traffic for your in-app driven games. So that's why there's some twists to it, but the growth strategies are definitely very different. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can take like one questions from the audience if we have. I have the question about gaming tile matching. Do you think there is the big chance for upcoming games from that genre?
Tile matching, Connect tiles, yes. So I think there have been some released by a Turkish studio in the past few years, specifically in the Connect titles, and even though the RPD for their game was like basically half of what typically you would expect from a match game, it was quite successful because it had hybrid monetization. I can share it like offline what the game was and the details of it, but it has some unique, I would say, sets that are not typical for match. So it's not purely in-app driven. It is a hybrid monetization, even for tier one markets like US. And that's, I think, how they managed to afford buying traffic, because despite the, I would say half of the in-app purchase, like from the ARPU perspective, they had enough to cover that gap from the ad revenue perspective. So that's still unique. There's a room for growth for sure, but yeah, you have to be precise about how you bring it to the market. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Dmitry. Applause for the Dmitry, of